Good afternoon. My name is Grace Araya, and I'm the Director of Community Systems Statewide Supports at Illinois Action for Children. If this is your first time joining us, I want to personally welcome you to our week of webinars. And if you're with us yesterday, welcome back. So we've partnered with Tamarack Institute to host a week-long series of webinars, really with the aim of equipping and supporting you in your efforts around community systems building. This week-long webinars would not have been possible without the generous support of Illinois State Board of Education. I would like to point that we still do have availability for the rest of the week. So if you haven't registered for the webinars for the rest of the week, please do so. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Liz Weaver, who's going to be your trainer, and I'm going to hand it off to her.
Thanks so much, Grace. And hi, everybody. Welcome to webinar number 2. I'm Liz Weaver. I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. I believe those of you that were on the webinar yesterday met my colleague, Lisa Atigala. And over the course of this week, you'll meet my other colleagues as well. Today's webinar is really going to focus on inquiry, but before we go into the content of the webinar, I want to do 2 things. The first is to acknowledge the land on which we're gathering today. So we begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land as settlers. We're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And I just want to let you know that I'm coming to you from the city of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And so my office is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas peoples. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792. And what's interesting is that Indigenous peoples have cared for the land around the Great Lakes since the beginning of history. So we want to acknowledge that. So the second thing that I'd like to do is invite my colleague, Duncan, onto the webinar for a minute, just to take us through some technology questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. Just before we get started, I have a few comments to help me make the most out of today's discussion. The first is that we would love your questions and comments. So if you have a comment at any point during the webinar, you can use the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom client, and just feel free to type in any comments or post any additional links that you think would be helpful. We'd really love to hear from you. The second is that at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for an extended Q&A session. So if you have questions at any point, feel free just to open up the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom client and submit your question that way. If you don't have a question, you can still participate. If you open up the Q&A panel, you'll be able to use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions you'd like to see answered. So on top of that, if you have any technical questions or you're having any issues, feel free to send me a private message in the chat and I'll be there to help you. Back to you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks so much, Duncan. So we've got the technical considerations over and done with. So let's now tell you a little bit about the Tamarack Institute. The Tamarack Institute is based in Canada, in Waterloo, Ontario. And we actually have 2 parts to our work. The first part is the Tamarack Learning Center. And so the workshops this week are being delivered by staff that primarily work in the Tamarack Learning Center, but we also advance practice. And so we work with about 400 communities across Canada, the United States, and internationally around reducing poverty, deepening communities, and a more recent addition to our cadre of collective impact leadership tables is a focus on communities building youth futures. And so that, in a nutshell, is the work. We like to say at Tamarack, it's a place where learning and practice come together. And so that's what we try to achieve at Tamarack. So this is the week of webinars for all of you. We began this week with creating a culture of engagement with my colleague Lisa. Today, we're going to dive into thinking about inquiry and deliberation. And then throughout the course of the rest of the week, Sylvia is going to spend some time with you around asset-based community development. I'm back on Thursday with you around facilitating co-design and what's an innovation process that you can bring into your work. And then we'll wrap up the week with Pamela, who will talk to you about participatory approaches to evaluation. So pretty much you get the whole gamut of the things that we're very interested in at Tamarack, a little dive into innovation, a little bit about community engagement, a little bit about co-design. So yeah, it's a great week. I've had the good opportunity to look at all of the presentations, and lots of content and lots of really great tools and resources throughout the week. So I wondered if we could start today with a little bit of a check-in with all of you. So here's a slide where there are 6 images on the slide, and we invite you in the chat box to note which image best represents how you're feeling today. So is it, like a butterfly, you're emerging from a cocoon? Do you feel that you're at the top of the pressure valve and almost in the red zone? Do you feel like you're a volcano ready to explode, or jumping between between a great divide, or you feel all tight and all kind of in a ball of wool, or like a drop with a splash and ripple kind of effect? And so those are your choices. We'll maybe give you a minute or so to think about, which of these images best represents you. And I can see, Duncan, that our chat box is getting kind of full. So why don't you tell us what you're seeing up here in the chat box?
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for sharing your number. You can continue to do so in the chat box. Overwhelmingly, I would say it's a split between 1, so the kind of the tangled ball of yarn, and number 6, the kind of the ripple effects, with a few of the others sprinkled in. Thankfully, I don't see a lot of 5s or 3s, just because those tend to be a bit more negative. But it looks like we have quite a spread, but mostly number 1 and number 6.
Yeah. This is a really interesting exercise. It's always great when you're facilitating groups to have an image or a number of images like this, or some way that you can have people kind of connect into the conversation that you're having. And so we hope you enjoyed this exercise. And it's interesting for me, on the other end, as someone who's delivering the content of the workshop, to hear where you all are sitting and what is kind of top of mind for all of you going forward. So this is our agenda. We're going to talk about the goals for the webinar, have a bit of a presentation, and then we're going to open it up to a final bit of question and answer session at the very end. So as we're going through, please do write your comments into the chat box, but also post your questions in the Q&A panel, as Duncan has noted. Okay, so for today, we're going to really focus on inquiry and deliberation. And so there's a context setting piece that I'm going to start with, which is really, how do we navigate change? And what are some of the challenges that we have around navigating change? Because right now, we are in very disruptive times, whether it's, because of COVID, because of some changes in government, because of, economic upheaval that we're going through. So there's lots of changes that we're facing, and we're seeing these in the participants that we're working with. And so it's really important to kind of think about, what does this mean for us and how do we feel about this? And then we're going to talk about inquiry as an approach. And then how do we sit in inquiry? How do we not rush to judgment or rush to problem solving? What are the benefits of sitting in inquiry? And then finally, we're going to do a little bit of a taster around co-design, which we're going to come back to on Thursday and go into a bit more detail around. So that's the intent of the webinar today. Okay, so let's just dive in. And this first slide comes from a colleague of ours at Tamarack, a guy named Mansky who developed a really interesting organization that provided wraparound supports for families with children with disabilities. And so he was looking at, how do we scale and spread social innovation? And, I love this quote because Al says in this quote that, we have lots of ingenuity and we have lots of creativity in the face of adversity. And so if you think about what has just happened in your organizations, responding to COVID, responding to some of these challenges, you've probably been fairly kind of creative. There's probably been lots of really quick decision making that you've had to experience. And so it is kind of thinking about, okay, so how do we look at the ingenuity that we have, the creativity that we have, and use it as a way, or leverage it as a way of kind of navigating through change. Another colleague that we have at Tamarack, Jim Clemmer, talks about the context for navigating disruptive change. And so these are the things that we're probably, we've either felt or are feeling, or maybe the feeling has passed, but sometimes it feels like there are forces beyond our control. There's kind of an overflow of information, that fear becomes more believable because we don't know what the future holds. And so in anticipating the future, we worry about way more things that are out of our control. And so we become more fearful. That sometimes that encourages some victim thinking, and that we can feel overwhelmed with the workload because not knowing the future prevents us from making choices, right? And so we're kind of going, okay, so I don't really know, how long this COVID stuff is going to last. So how are we going to make choices? We can't make any choices about our next vacation because we don't know. So there's things like that. So Jim Clemmer goes on to say, we have ways that we can respond to change, right? We can kind of be in the reactive space. We can be in the survivor space, just kind of trying to get by and let's wait and see what happens. Or we can be in the proactive or navigator space. And it's really interesting at Tamarack, we're trying to be much more in the navigator space. And so a really good example of navigating the change is to say, okay, so what is it that we can make decisions about? Even though we don't know the full future, are there things where we can say, well, for the next 6 months, we are going to operate with these decisions, with these guidelines? What are the choices that we have? What's the inquiry? So we were using inquiry in many ways to say, okay, so where do we land in terms of some of these change choices? Another way of looking at this is an image that was circulating around a couple of months ago when COVID was first coming upon all of us. And it was really, for me, it spoke to me, and we shared it around our team at Tamarack to really say, okay, so what zone do we want to be in? Are we in the fear zone? Are we in the learning zone? Let's just watch what's happening in our organization, what's happening to the colleagues that we're working with, to the other organizations that we're partnering with, and then how do we begin to move into the growth zone? So again, it's another opportunity to think about, okay, so how do we navigate change? What are the three zones that we're all walking through in different ways, but all kind of walking through these together? And how do we more intentionally move ourselves away from the fear zone into the learning zone and into the growth zone? And so, I love the growth zone because I think it's got some really positive things in it, like being appreciative and being grateful, despite all the challenges and all the things that we have faced. How can we be grateful about the things that, the small things that our colleagues have done for us, the small decisions that we've made, the fact that we can gather together in a webinar and use technology in new and different kinds of ways. And what does that look like? An example of that for us at Tamarack is that we encouraged our team members to use, each of them has access to their own Zoom account, and to not only use their Zoom accounts for work so that they could connect to one another, but then to think about how they could use their Zoom accounts in their private time and with their families to connect more proactively with their family members. And I know that when I was hosting Zoom calls with my family, we had at one point 5 different continents represented. So we had family members from New Zealand, from the Philippines, from Italy, from Holland. So it was really kind of much more of a global experience that we had. So I was appreciative and grateful for that. So really helpful as a framing kind of tool when we think about navigating change. Another way of thinking about this, and this was the content of a paper that I wrote at the very kind of March, April timeframe. But, we kind of have gone through these 3 phases, not unlike the fear, learning, and growth zone. We have had the respond zone. So communities have come together and responded really quickly. We're now somewhat in recovery, maybe in the early stages of recovery. And then how do we begin to more intentionally build some resilience? And so what's interesting about this resource are the questions, right? Those inquiries. So rather than be definitive, think about what are the questions that you might add to, this list around responding, recovering, and building resilience. My colleague, Mark Cabage, has kind of said, the future is still a little bit undetermined, right? And so we have been going through a bit of a planning process and have done some scenario planning. And basically, we've identified 3 possible scenarios for the future. And so what's interesting about these 3 scenarios, these 3 kind of future scenarios, is that we don't know which one is going to happen. And we're all kind of sitting in this place right now. And so this is why inquiry is even more important as a tool, as a way of kind of understanding where we are right now and what possible futures might be. And so he says, Mark says that, it could be that we will return to the old equilibrium, we'll return to the old patterns and ways of being that we were in before. And what would that mean to the work that we've done now that we've gone through this pretty big disruption? What does that mean? And there's a real push in many of us to return to the old ways. I know I was on a call yesterday. And someone said, "Oh man, I know we're doing lots of stuff by Zoom, but I really just want to see you in a face-to-face meeting," right? And so there's a push, a natural push in all of us to kind of go back to the places where we have those face-to-face meetings and gatherings. Some of you are already doing it, but not all of us are, and it's probably more socially and physically distanced from one another. And so what I know that there is this kind of hunkering for this old way of being. There might be that this disruption leads to a different kind of equilibrium or a new equilibrium, because one of the things that I think COVID and some of the other things that we've seen, this economic imbalance that we've seen in our communities, is that the old ways of working don't necessarily work anymore. And so how do we get to this new equilibrium? And then the final potential future is that we're going to be in these continual disruptions, right? So, we've got COVID, and then we've got some of the racial inequity that we've observed and some of the financial inequity. And so there are these kind of disruptions, and there might be disruptions around climate change. So how do we manage in this new state of disequilibrium? And so Mark is posing the fact that we don't exactly know what the future is. It might be one of 3 different kinds of futures, maybe 4 different kinds of futures. And so we can see why, when Jim Clemmer says, there are these 3 kind of choices that we have, that sometimes we might just kind of lean into the victim choice because it's a bit overwhelming. And so how do we go into the navigation of change choice? And then the final thing that I think we go back to Alan Mansky and some of his thinking about innovation. And he really says 5 things, right? So if we're really trying to navigate past these uncertain futures, or readapt our organizations in such a way, or our collaboratives in such a way that we're looking at a new future, here are the pieces of advice that Al has from his observations of groups that are kind of moving forward in innovative ways. And so one is to think about your work, act like an organization, but think like a movement, right? So how do we become a movement for change? What would that look like? What are the things that we share with others that they also want to move forward? How do we ask the right kinds of questions? And that's what we're going to focus on this webinar today. What are the people around us saying, right? What's the popular culture? What are those meta messages? But then also, how do we get into people's hearts as well as their minds? Where's the political wind blowing, in which direction? And then finally, really looking at learning. How do we learn from what we're observing and the changes that are happening in real time? And learning is essential, and learning is directly kind of connected to this notion of inquiry. So that's the context. We're in these kind of changing times. We still don't know what the future is. We might have some observations about what it might look like, but there's still lots of stuff that is shifting. And so in many ways, we've got to think about, okay, what are the questions that we want to begin to be thinking about, and particularly as we think about it from a collaboration perspective, right? Because one of the things that we've observed at Tamarack is that during the pandemic, those communities with collaboration infrastructure, people leaned into that collaboration infrastructure even more. And to navigate these uncertain futures, we need the wisdom of everybody. And so how do we use inquiry as a collaboration tool? So this comes from an organization in the United States called Human Systems Dynamics. I believe they're based in Iowa, although I could be wrong about that. But what's really interesting is that they focus all of their work on trying to ask questions, right? So really focusing on inquiry, that it's about every interaction, every situation, every opportunity, and to enter into those with questions, and then begin to see what patterns emerge out of those questions, right? And sometimes some of their work is just only about asking questions. And as you invite the whole group to ask questions as opposed to engage in answers, the question kind of emerges out of the answer emerges out of the questions that are asked. And so it's really interesting to kind of think about, how do we spend more time intentionally asking questions about the things that are challenging us in the work that we're doing. So they have 4 approaches that they've identified as kind of key patterns or key ways of staying or standing in inquiry. And so one is to switch judgment into inquiry, right? So not to think about, I know the answer, but more it's like, okay, so what are the questions that I want to ask about that issue or that opportunity or the way that we're collaborating? So it's really kind of a switch of mindset. The other one is to turn disagreement into kind of shared expectations. And so we might disagree about the approach, but we all have things that we hold in common. We all want things that are better for our communities, better for, our own prosperity. There are some things that we have in common. So how do we get to those shared expectations to turn defensiveness into self-reflection? So, if you said something that might have, for me, made me think about something in a very negative or conflictual kind of way, why did I have that reaction? What happened in what you said and my reaction to it? And so that's about that kind of self-reflection process. And then it's really about turning our assumptions about the other into questions themselves, right? So to really say, well, rather than I assume that you bring this kind of way, this worldview to the table, I'm going to ask you questions about it. So they use a pretty simple tool to go through all of this, and it's kind of like, how do we do this in a practical kind of way? And so the tool is called, it's the three kind of core questions, right? What? So what just happened? What just happened? So what does this mean? And now are we going to do about this? Pretty simple. And it's a great way of leaning into inquiry as a kind of a way of thinking about this work. So the what is about what patterns do you notice now? What patterns do you want to see? What patterns might be emerging for you? Then the so what questions are around, what do these patterns mean to our collective work? And this is really helpful from a collaborative kind of perspective. And then the now what is the future orientation. The what and the so what is the sense making about the now. And the now what is the future orientation, right? It's what are we going to do? What are our paths forward? What are the next steps? And we're going to talk a little bit more about the now what. So now what, if we want to really be successful in thinking about, okay, so what is next for us? You want to ask questions that you can't answer, right? And you want to seek to understand the people that you disagree with. And so, what if kind of questions are really powerful in this kind of perspective, right? What if? What are the possible, what if we did this? What if we looked at this problem in a different kind of way? What if in some of the work that I've done in community change, we used a question a lot about what would it take, which is another kind of question, right? Which opens you up to the possibilities. And I think in this case, asking questions that you can't answer are really those questions that open you up to a whole range of different kinds of possibilities. The second now what way of being is really to find comfort with ambiguity, to recognize that, it's okay not to have the answer. It's okay to say there are three possible futures for us. We don't know which one. So, how do we prepare ourselves for each of these futures? What do we have to imagine as the reality of each of those futures? And then ask questions around that. And what's the ambiguity between those different futures that we see? The third way of being is to really think about being open and really look for learning, meaning, and sense making, looking at patterns, enabling others to, or asking others to teach you what they know about the issue or the opportunity. Try to find those teachers in your collective work. And then finally, considering your own personal interactions through the lens of inquiry. And so, I know that so often we're caught up in the world of the doing, as opposed to the world of inquiry, right? What does it mean? What are the patterns that have emerged? How am I reacting to things? What are the pieces of information that I don't know anything about, and who are the people that I could bring into my circle to help me answer some of those questions? And so it really is interesting. I had gone to a course with the folks from Human Systems Dynamics, and one of the things that I took away from that course was how often I rush to judgment myself or rush to a solution myself, as opposed to really kind of thinking about what are the questions that I should be asking first. And so I acknowledge that inquiry is a practice, right? It's not something that we're going to get right away. It's just something that we've got to kind of continually practice. And so the what, so what, and now what I think is a really great pattern for practicing inquiry. But there are two other tools I want to take you through in a second, and also share with you a little bit more about, how you might be able to do this. The folks at Human Systems Dynamics also talk about patterns and pattern logic, and so they have you enter into spaces and then really try to observe and recognize the patterns. So really try to be in that space and say, what am I observing right now? What are the boundaries that define the space? What are the differences in the space that are making a difference? And what are the connections between and among the spaces? And so want you in the chat box, if you have an opportunity, to share some of your observations about how your collaborative or your organization has reacted to the challenges of COVID. And so use the approaches to kind of talk about the patterns that you've observed either in your organization or in some collaborative work that you've been involved in. Did patterns emerge for you? Were there some boundaries that defined how you worked together, how you collaborated? Did you move from face-to-face meetings to all Zoom meetings? And when you moved to Zoom meetings, that actually shifted interaction. So what are some of those things that you've noticed? What are some of the things that really made a difference for you? I wonder, Duncan, if folks are putting anything into the chat box around patterns and really trying to grapple with pattern and pattern logic.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So far, it's mostly what you've mentioned in terms of having to adapt to virtual and how, as one person put it, like the boundary between work and home is much more blended than it used to be, which I think makes a lot of sense just given the physical boundaries are gone now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And so the boundaries, I know when I'm doing my work from home, as we all do at TEMRAC, I have to shut doors, right? Otherwise, my office is in a little bit of a walkthrough space in my home. And so, what are the boundaries and what are the things I have to do to create a kind of quiet space so I can do webinars and that kind of thing. I think it's also very interesting, Duncan, to kind of consider how, COVID has done many of these shifts. And so what I would encourage the folks who are on the webinar today to maybe spend some time after the webinar and think about these three things, right? So what are the boundaries in the new spaces that you're working? What are the differences? So what are the things that really make a difference? Is there more connection? Is there more face-to-face connection via Zoom and other platforms, or is there less face-to-face connection? What's making a difference? And then what's the splash and ripple effect of those things that are making a difference? So thanks, Duncan, for that. So a couple of other tools for moving in inquiry. Some of you might say, okay, so the what, so what, now what? A little harder to do. Here's another kind of tool, and this comes from a website called Liberating Structures. And Liberating Structures is a great website. They have about 33 different tools on the website, and they tell you how to facilitate these tools and give you a lot of background information about them. So they say a great inquiry tool is appreciative interviews. And appreciative interviews come out of the appreciative design work that's out there. And so the big idea behind appreciative interviews is that you're appreciating, you're looking for the best thing as opposed to, the worst thing that could possibly happen. So here's an example of an appreciative interview. Please tell me a story about a time when you worked on a challenge with others and you were proud of what you accomplished. What's the story? What made that success possible? So there you can see in that what they're asking in that interview is for the person to really share what made that thing successful. What did they achieve? What did they feel proud of? And so that's really a great way of kind of framing an appreciative interview. And you can do appreciative interviews on a whole bunch of different things. So you could use appreciative interviews, for example, in how your collaborative might be responding to COVID, right? So what did we do really well? What were some of the successes? What were some of the some of the patterns and some of the behaviors that really helped us navigate this pretty disruptive change that we went through? And so that's another way of using the appreciative interview process. And it's about trying to, because people will leverage and lean into the things that are positive. And so that's what an appreciative interview process is about. The second tool is a tool that again comes from liberating structures, and it's called the 9 whys. And so the 9 whys essentially is to ask why over and over and over again, up to 9 times. And the idea behind the 9 whys is that you become closer and closer and closer to the key reason behind the purpose or the root cause. So here's an example coming from liberating structures as well. So when what do you do when you're working on something, and then you keep on asking, why is that important to you, and why and why and why? And so it really is, you might not necessarily always have to go to 9, but the more you can probe and the more you can ask the why question, the deeper you will get to understanding kind of what makes that important to other people. And so you can use the what, so what, now what. You can use appreciative interviews, or you can also, use 9 whys as a tool. I believe that Toyota used 7 whys as part of their Kaizen continuous improvement process. And so 9 whys just takes you a little bit deeper in terms of trying to get to kind of the root causes. So questions and thinking about how you're going to ask questions, framing conversation as a question, really spending time, even with the 9 whys, you might then say, okay, so I've asked you these 9 whys. Here are the things that you said. Here are the patterns that I saw emerge out of that. So you can use pattern recognition, pattern logic as a tool for navigating the 9 whys as well. So we're going to stop for a second and see if there are any questions that have popped up, or also encourage you, to, as you're listening to the webinar, to post some questions. But Duncan, are there any questions that have popped up?
First, I just wanted to mention a comment that came in that was slightly different than what we had talked about regarding the shift from COVID. And it's from Thomas, and they write, we're all virtual. However, I need to come into the building every day. I had to adjust to not having one around within the school. It's not the same, at first lonely. My work continues into the evening when folks reach out to me. So it's interesting that that's almost the opposite, where their physical place hasn't shifted, but the context within that physical place is radically different because of COVID.
Yeah, I have a next door neighbor who's also a teacher within the Canadian school system, and he goes into work every day, but spends his whole day in front of a computer doing virtual teaching. So yeah, he's in the work environment, but his environment is really all virtual, right? And he doesn't have that same kind of interaction that you have when you go in and there are lots of other people around and you have the interaction within the classroom. And he was commenting on that. So yeah, it's interesting, right? To think about, okay, so what does that mean for me? I heard Thomas say, he referred to, or you said, Duncan, on his behalf, the notion of loneliness. So even though we're collected in a shared space, we're still individually and isolated from one another. And so, what are the patterns, and how can we, navigate our way through some of those more disruptive patterns?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Our next question comes from Janet, and they ask, can you give an example of engaging with popular culture?
Oh yeah, so that's a good one. Sometimes they can be positive and sometimes they can be negative, depending on where you are. But engaging with popular culture might be things like being on social media and observing what people are saying on social media, and also thinking about what are the dominant things that people are talking about in social media. And do you have on your social media channel, just like that channel where you hear all the things that you think about? Or do you have groups in your social media access that give you different perspectives and different ways of thinking? So I would think that popular culture comes out that way. Popular culture might also come out in things like watching and observing different media sources. Popular culture also comes out in terms of, television and what different shows are talking about or what their key subjects are in terms of that. Popular culture can also come out in places like local government. So, what are the priorities of local government and what are local elected officials putting on the agenda for the community and the civic agenda? And so there's lots of different ways that you can tap into this. I think the one thing that you have to pay attention to is what are the patterns that are emerging out of popular culture, but also do you have enough links into different perspectives, right? Or is it that you're only listening to an echo chamber of your own perspectives? And so when I'm on Twitter or when I get engaged with different forms of social media, I try to follow people that I might not necessarily agree with their perspectives, because I do want to kind of hear both sides of the story and then I would ask myself, what does that mean? And, and also think about, what my own biases are, both, the biases that I have that I know about, but also some of those unconscious biases. So Duncan, any more questions?
Yeah, thanks. We have one more at the moment, and it's about reconciling differences when you go through an inquiry process to talk about an organization, and what you've discovered during that inquiry process is different or sometimes vastly different than how the organization views itself. How would you go about reconciling that?
Oh, that is a really good question. So yeah, it's interesting to think about, what's the narrative that we tell ourselves about our organization? And I think that that's a really interesting question. There's a great tool where you can uncover narratives called the story spine. It's a tool where you help people. It's a kind of a backgrounder, and everybody creates a story, but the story spine gives you this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, but people create their story based on a framework, right? And so you can say, okay, and you can use a tool like a story spine to understand the nuances of the different stories. Because if you were to just spend time saying, okay, so what's the story that we tell ourselves? It might be that people will share a story that they believe to be the story. So, yeah, so using individual capturing of stories, like a story spine kind of exercise, helps you kind of really understand what the differences are. And then if you see in the patterns that there are pretty big differences in the story, then you want to kind of think about, okay, so what's the next set of questions that we would ask about this, right? So what are we seeing, right? What did we hear? So what does this mean to us? And then now what are we going to do about it? I think that what now what could be a very helpful tool in that. You could use appreciative interviews if you wanted to, have a conversation about that. If the divide is, pretty significant, I would then want to think about, okay, so, be a bit thoughtful about maybe not talking about the divide initially, but talking about, what is creating this divide, right? So it's not about the two ends of the spectrum. It's about kind of understanding some of the details behind the divide and what has created it? Is it, is it that people come from different places in the organization? Is it that people have different experiences in the organization? What is it that has created this big gulf of a divide? And then out of the what, can you do things about it? Or does the differences, because sometimes, well, often differences add some real value in terms of thinking and perspectives and things like that. And so, how can you use the differences in a way that can help advance the collective or shared work? That's a great question.
Good. We had one last question come in just as you were saying that. Where does culture come into play, and how sensitive do we need to be when we're doing some of these inquiry exercises across cultures?
That's another really good question. I think culture, Peter Drucker famously said, I think it's Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so often we move forward on strategy without really knowing, what are the cultural levers that can help advance the strategy, or what are some of the cultural biases or the cultural barriers that prevent the strategy from moving forward. So I think culture is an important factor, and it is kind of thinking about as you're going into these processes to think about, what do we have to pay attention to from a cultural perspective, right? Is it that there is a divide or different perspectives that will create some of that more challenging conversation. And I think I actually don't think that's a bad thing. I think it is a good thing. I think I would, even before I went into an inquiry process, I might ask questions about what do we have to pay attention to from a cultural perspective. And rather than answer that, come up with a lot more questions around that, right? And so in the identification, you might have a number of people that, just stand in inquiry around that. And then what will emerge from that are things that you have to naturally pay attention to for the group or the work that you're doing. So that will surface it. So Duncan, I have couple more slides just to introduce people to a process that we're going to talk about on Thursday a little bit more. And I know, and then we'll open it back up for questions. So we're going to do a really quick introduction of this, but on Thursday, we're going to go into this process a little bit in a little bit more depth. And this is the whole idea about co-design, right? And co-design, one of the things that's really interesting about co-design, it's the kind of combination between engaging your community in a thoughtful way and really beginning to kind of identify, I guess is the right word, to identify where, things really can be designed in a way that supports the development of the community in a positive kind of way. And one of the critical elements in the co-design process is really this notion of practicing inquiry, right? It's really about, in many ways, co-design is about really doing a diverging kind of exercise before we converge. And so that inquiry piece is asking the right kind of questions, thinking big, synthesizing, thinking big, and then synthesizing. And again, if you think about, the slide, when we first talked about inquiry, this notion of not rushing to judgment, right? It's really about being comfortable in the kind of divergent thinking that you're trying to seed in the conversations. And really it's about listening for the differences as opposed to pitting one side against the other. It's trying to surface what are the differences that we have to pay attention to. And so the co-design process has kind of 4 steps to it, but there could be more. So you could go through the kind of double diamond. This is called the double diamond process. And you might come out of the double diamond and say, hey, we got to go back out again and think a little bit more about this. Or we don't, our path forward is that we need to do a little bit more deliberation, a little bit more diverging before we're converging. And so in this case, the divergent is really inviting the different perspectives, right? And so it might be that you diverge in an inquiry kind of way. What are the questions that we should be asking about the importance of culture as a part of an inquiry process, right? And so then you just, in the diverging part, you don't actually come to answers, but you just surface questions, right? It's a bit of an ideation process, but there are, the idea behind it is that you don't actually, you spend time just surfacing them. And then you might converge. Okay, so we've asked all these questions about the importance of culture. What are the things that we might need to be focusing on? What are important to us as a group? Or you might ask another set of questions. And so the converging is really about forming a common vision about it. Then you diverge out. You might build some more ideas. Okay, so what could we do? What's in the realm of our possibilities? What do we have the resources to be able to do to tackle this issue even further? And then how do we move forward? What's the path moving forward? So that's the double diamond process, and it is a very much a process that you can work with your collaborative tables around in terms of really taking them through inquiry, but really holding off on decision making, and then converging out again to get some bigger ideas, and then kind of diverging in again or converging in again. Um, so one of the things that we wanted to do in this process is to actually have you think about a collaborative challenge that you or your collaborative is currently facing. So to maybe put that in the chat box, and then think about how this process might be helpful, how this double diamond process of asking questions and taking people through deliberative kind of conversations can be helpful for that challenge that your organization or your collaborative is currently facing. And so it's helpful to kind of take through. So Duncan, do we have any challenge that someone has put into the chat box?
Yeah, we've had a few challenges pop up from Amber funding, which that kind of gets straight to it. We've also had a few people reach out about COVID making it more difficult to reach rural partners, because that's the only way to reach people now. And if bandwidth or accessibility is an issue, it just makes it so much worse. So those seem to be the first or the biggest two so far.
Okay. So so funding for sure, that would be an interesting one, right? So you'd want to diverge out, so have that divergent conversation, and maybe part of the divergent conversation might be not only funding but resources, right? So what are the resources that we need, or where could we get access to the resources that we need to be able to move forward this collaborative work? And that includes human resources and financial resources, goods and services. So you could almost break it down even further like that. And that would be kind of a great, and the group could brainstorm on, where might those resources exist, who might have access to them, where might we find them in the community. So those would be conversations that you have, or what do we mean by resources, and what are some of the resource challenges that we're currently facing, right? And it might be that it is financial, but it could also be human resources or time, or that kind of thing. So there's a couple different ways you could go into the divergent conversation. And then the convergent is, what do we need to do to get prepared to access these resources? That could be a convergent, right? So we need to identify who knows what. We might need to develop funding proposal, etc. What are some of the what are some, or you might even come back at the convergent to what kind of projects do we need resources for? And then you want to diverge out and think about those projects and then converge back in about, okay, so what are the next steps? So that's a really good one. If you applied the question around technology and bandwidth in rural communities, the question might be different, right? You might say, okay, so we're having difficulty connecting with folks in rural communities because of technology. So the divergent question might be, what are some innovative ways that we could connect with people that didn't use technology or that uh, didn't make us so reliant on technology, and really begin to diverge out what that could look like, right? And then the converging might be, how do we support some of these different kinds of ways when, when we're trying to do it? And then what's the purpose of, connecting with people and then convergence? So you want to kind of think about what are the questions in terms of each of the phases, and how do you navigate them as you go forward? But it is interesting, right? Because we would think to ourselves, oh, technology is a barrier. That's the barrier that we're facing. But there might be other barriers that, as you begin to diverge out, you might uncover some of those other barriers, or you might uncover some opportunities that, are more personal. I had someone today call me using the telephone, right? And he said, I'm so sick of Zoom. I decided, I used to just always call you by phone, and I just decided today I would just call you by phone again, right? So, what are the things that, what are some of those other ways that we can ensure connection, or we can build connection that don't necessarily only rely on technology? So again, kind of an interesting way of thinking about, how to use this, and when you bring a bunch of folks around a table, think about the questions, the diverging out questions and the converging in question, the diverging out question and the converging in question as you go through the double diamond process. So I think that's very interesting. So the final thing that, and we can go to a couple more questions, Duncan, if we have time. But the final thing that we'd love to have you also do in the chat box is to talk about maybe one of the ideas that I shared, or one of the approaches that I shared, that might be something that you think, I might be able to use that in my collaborative work. And so write your ideas in the chat box. But Duncan, any other questions? Maybe I think we have time for maybe one more.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. We had two anonymous questions about roughly the same thing, so I'll just kind of merge them together. What advice do you have for groups or individuals where the divergent process that you're discussing turns into conflict?
Oh, that's a good question. I would then, if it does identify or surface conflict, I might then, in the converging part of it, say how, because those are often called wicked questions, right? Where one thing is in diametrical opposition to the other. And so wicked questions or wicked problems are ones where we have to kind of be a little bit more intentional in terms of thinking through, what are the questions that we want to ask? How do we solve this in a way that gets at both and kind of parts of the resolution? But I'd want to say then, okay, so we've surfaced in the divergence of conflict. What could we do in our path forward that might be able to resolve this conflict? Or what are the things that we need to be paying attention to so that we don't exacerbate the conflict? So you might surface questions like that, get at the conflict, because I think if you don't get at the conflict, then it just sits under the surface. And I think you want to kind of raise it up and say, hey, these things are, in conflict with one another. What are you might even ask the question, what are the benefits of having this tension in place, right? Like, what are the benefits to us by having something that is in opposition with one another, because sometimes there are benefits in conflict. And so, conflict isn't always a bad thing. It actually does move processes forward. I like to talk a lot about collective impact, and in collective impact, there's always a tension, right? A tension between the process of collective impact and the product that you're trying to achieve, right? The reduction of poverty, the better outcomes for kids in graduating from high school. So there's always that tension in there, and so asking questions about the tension, I think, can be a really healthy thing. So, Duncan, I see we're coming to the end of our time. Did people put some ideas in the chat box about what they'd like to work on going forward, or what idea they might test?
Yeah, no specific ideas, but lots of good comments about that divergent model, about working through questions like that. I think that's going to be one of the main things people are holding on to, which I agree with. As just listening in the background here, I think that's a really, really interesting way to work through a problem, especially if you're asking questions in the right way. So that's overwhelmingly kind of the takeaway here.
Yeah, great. Well, for those of you that are interested in that model and that approach, and diving in a little bit more into design, we're going to spend going into it in a bit more. I'll walk you through some additional steps to the double diamond process. So, if you haven't registered already for Thursday or for the other workshops, please do. And over to you, Duncan.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm just putting a link in the chat to Thursday's session. You can also just go to the main session page for the week of webinars here and register all at once for all of the sessions within the webinar. If you're with us yesterday, you'll know this, but everyone who registered for the call today will receive an email tomorrow. And in that email will be a few things: a full recording of today's call, a copy of the slides, and a collection of links and resources that were mentioned. So for today's call, that'll be links to each of the tools that Liz referenced and walked us through today. We encourage you, if you haven't already, to register for the rest of the webinars in this session. And we hope to see you throughout the week. Thanks, Liz.